The tribute ground was where the unwanted were offered to the monster. She was the only one who wasn't afraid because she already knew his name. Snow had been falling for 6 hours. The kind of snow that doesn't drift, it descends with intention, blanketing the platform in silence so complete that Maya Andal could hear the heartbeats of the women beside her. Rapid, terrified. Hers was steady. She should not have been here, but she was. Bound at the wrists and gagged with a silencing veil drawn so tight across her jaw that breathing was an act of defiance, she stood at the far left of the tribute line, separated from the 16 weeping women by 3 armed guards and the weight of her father's ambition. Lord Morin had dressed for the occasion. She could see him at the platform's edge, furred and self-satisfied, watching her with the flat eyes of a man delivering livestock. The tribute master's voice cracked through the cold air, reciting words older than any of the kingdoms represented here. The ancient pact. 17 women for the beast's consideration. 1 chosen. The rest returned. No one mentioned what had happened to the ones chosen before. Then the wind stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The temperature dropped so fast that one of the guards beside Maya inhaled sharply and took a step backward. The torches guttered to half their height. And from the tree-line, from the darkness between the pines where no light reached and no sound had ever carried, something came. He was not what the story said. The tales described a monster, hunched, grotesque, something broken into animal shape by a witch's cruelty. The figure that materialized from the swirling white was none of those things. He was enormous in the way that mountains are enormous, not threatening so much as simply true. Bare-chested despite the cold that had already turned 2 of the guards' lips blue, his skin carrying the frost-blue undertone of something only partially human, white hair falling past shoulders mapped with living ice runes that shifted as he moved. His hands hung loose at his sides. He did not need to hold a weapon. He was the weapon. His eyes swept the line. Maya watched him dismiss them. Not cruelly. There was no cruelty in his face, no hunger, no malice. There was only the hollow assessment of a man who had seen too many centuries to feel anything as small as excitement. He looked at each woman the way one might look at a door that would not open. Expected to be disappointed. Already somewhere else. Until he reached her. His pale eyes stopped. And something in Maya's chest, something she had kept locked behind years of silence and survival, rose like a tide. She had been a name-speaker since birth. When she looked at someone, their true name surfaced in her mind unbidden, not the name their parents had given them, not the name carved on their tombstone, but the name underneath. The name that was them, wholly and completely stripped of every performance and pretense. Usually those names came quietly. A whisper. A breath. His was a blizzard. It tore through her with the force of something 3 centuries old and furious to be known. It was not one word. It was ancient syllables strung together like a storm, and they hit the back of her teeth and demanded release, and she could not. She was gagged. She was silenced. She was bound. She spoke it anyway. Through the cloth. Through the veil. Muffled and imperfect and unmistakable. The northern beast went utterly, completely still. The crowd stopped breathing. The tribute master's scroll fell from his fingers. The guards beside Maya stepped back, not because they were ordered to, but because their bodies understood something their minds hadn't caught yet. Even Lord Morin, standing at the platform's edge with his furred chest and his cold calculations, went perfectly still. John Svensson turned to face her fully. 300 years of solitude and frost, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he had stopped believing existed. He walked to her. He stopped a foot away, close enough that she could see the ice crystals caught in his white lashes, close enough to feel the cold radiating off him like heat off stone. He studied her face above the silencing veil. His expression was unreadable. But his hands, those enormous, frost-rimed hands, had stopped completely still at his sides. "You spoke my true name. Do you understand what that means?" She held his gaze and said nothing. She couldn't. But her eyes said it clearly enough. Yes. She understood. He reached out and tore the silencing veil from her face in one clean motion. Then he turned to the tribute master, and in a voice like ice cracking over deep water, he said, "I have chosen." Quick pause, comment where you're watching from, and if you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. I've got a lot more coming. She woke warm. That was the first surprise. She had not expected warmth. She had not expected to wake at all. The chamber was vast and still, carved from dark stone that held the cold without releasing it, the walls draped in white pelts that swallowed the echo of the fire crackling in the iron hearth. There were no windows. The light was amber and low. Maya lay on something soft furs, thick and real, and when she pushed herself upright, her wrists were free. The silencing veil was gone. She touched her jaw instinctively, feeling the ghost of the binding still pressing against her skin, and then she became aware of him. John Svensson sat across the fire from her. Not pacing, not threatening. Sitting with the absolute stillness of a man who had centuries of practice at waiting, his pale eyes fixed on her with the calm, methodical attention of a scholar studying a text he had not yet decided whether to trust. The ice runes on his forearms moved slowly, a faint pulse, like breathing. He had destroyed the veil. She could see the cloth on the floor near his feet, torn clean in two. "You slept for nearly a day," he said. His voice was low and even, carrying a resonance she felt more in her chest than her ears. "Your body was in shock. Where are the others?" Her voice came out rough, disused. "The other tributes. Return to their kingdoms. As the pact demands." He held her gaze. "You are here because I chose you. That is also the pact." She looked at him steadily. She had been afraid of many things in her life. Fear had been a constant companion since the day her mother died and her father first understood what lived on her daughter's tongue. She had learned to wear stillness like armor over the fear, to keep her breathing even when everything in her wanted to break. She was afraid now. She simply chose not to show him. "You want to know what I did," she said. "I want to know what you are." She told him the truth. There was no point in anything else. He had seen her speak through a silencing veil, had felt his true name in her mouth. Lies would be an insult to both of them. She was a name speaker. Had been since birth, her mother before her, and her mother's mother before that, and back through a lineage that her father had done everything in his power to sever and erase. When she looked at a person, their true name rose in her like a tide she couldn't entirely contain. Not the name history had given them. The name underneath. The real one. "Yours," she said carefully, "was the loudest I have ever heard." Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly. More like the recognition of a thing he had suspected and hoped was wrong. The silence stretched between them. She let it. She had learned that silence could be a kind of speech, that what a person did with quiet told you more than any words they chose. He did not fill the silence with threats or posturing. He sat with it the way he sat with everything, completely, without restlessness. And then he made her an offer. She could stay. As his consort, in name only, the arrangement whatever she required it to be, with freedom to speak without restraint, protection from every lord and agent her father might send. In exchange, she would keep silence about his true name and remain while he studied what she was, cataloged her gift, understood it. It was a cold offer, practical and precise. He did not dress it in sentiment or pretend it was anything other than an arrangement of mutual convenience. She considered it the way she had been taught to consider every trap from every angle. One condition, she said. He waited. I will call you by your chosen name, not the one I spoke. She held his gaze. A true name used carelessly is a weapon. I won't carry one aimed at you unless you give me reason. The silence that followed this was different from the last one. He studied her for a long moment, as though recalibrating, as though she had just revealed a configuration he hadn't predicted. John, he said finally. You may call me John. Mana. She did not offer her family name. He did not ask for it. The fire crackled between them. Outside, somewhere in the darkness of Thurvold, wind moved through stone corridors like something alive and searching. She had chosen the beast. Now she had to survive him. She explored Thurvold the way she had learned to explore every dangerous place, carefully, with her hands in her pockets and her eyes open. The fortress was vast beyond any scale she had been prepared for. Not the cold opulence of her father's hall, all polished stone and displayed wealth. Thurvold was raw, ancient. The ceiling soared 3 stories in the main corridors, the walls carved from dark rock that held cold like a living thing, the floors covered in pelt so thick that her footsteps were swallowed completely. There were no tapestries, no paintings, no decorative frivolities. Whatever aesthetic the fortress followed was one of absolute function, stripped of every human comfort except fire. There were fireplaces everywhere. In every room, every corridor junction, every alcove. She counted 14 in the first hour alone. She understood why when she found the frost. It was not decoration. She had thought, at first, that the patterns creeping along the stone walls were some architectural feature, something carved into the rock deliberately, the way kingdoms carved their sigils into gates. But the patterns moved. Slowly, barely perceptibly, the way shadows move across a floor as the sun shifts, but they moved. Branching outward from some central unseen source, reaching into corners, climbing toward the ceiling in spirals that repeated themselves with fractal precision. The curse. She had read about it in books her father had tried to burn. 3 centuries ago, a witch who had loved John Svensson and been refused had sealed a frost into his blood, not to kill him, but to consume him from the inside in perfect inverse proportion to how much he lived. The more he retreated, the slower it spread. The more he felt, the faster. 300 years of isolation had been slow suicide in installments. She touched the wall near one of the patterns. The frost was real, cold, and crystalline under her fingertip, smooth where the tendrils ran, rough at the growing edges. And then, very clearly, she felt it recoil. Not much. A millimeter, perhaps. A fraction. She pressed her palm flat against the stone. The pattern drew back from her hand as if burned. She was still standing there when she felt him behind her. She had not heard him approach. She wondered if she ever would, whether footsteps were simply something he had ceased to make. 300 years of silence, teaching the body to move like weather rather than like a man. You shouldn't touch the walls. His voice came from 3 feet behind her. Close enough to be a statement about proximity, but not about threat. The pattern retreated from my hand. She didn't move, didn't turn around. You saw it. A pause. Yes. Does that happen with anyone else? Another pause, longer this time. She had learned in a single day that the length of his silences meant something. The short ones were calculation. The long ones were things he didn't want to say. No, he said. It does not. She turned then. He was standing exactly where she had imagined him, 3 feet back, filling the corridor with the simple fact of his size, his pale eyes on the handprint she'd left in the frost. Something was moving in his expression that she didn't yet have a name for. Not the vocabulary for it. She filed it away. Tell me about the curse, she said. I told you the terms of our arrangement. Studying your power. Not. The frost pulls back from my skin, she said. That is relevant to studying my power. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze with the particular steadiness of a woman who had survived her father's house, which meant she had learned to be still in the presence of things that could destroy her. He told her about the curse. Not all of it. She understood, even then, that there were layers he was keeping behind doors she hadn't earned the right to open. But the broad shape of it, the witch, the frost, the 3-century bargain of isolation. The slower he consumed the world, the slower the world consumed him. She listened without interrupting. And when he finished, she said, The patterns grow more complex when you stand near me. And they recede when I touch them. Yes, that suggests the curse responds to proximity, to warmth. Yes. Something shifted in his expression, a tightening at the jaw, barely visible. Which is why you should not touch the walls. Not because it harms you. Because the recoil, he stopped. The recoil feeds back, she finished. Into you. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She looked at him, at the frost runes tracing his forearms, at the place where the curse was written on his body in patterns that matched the ones receding from her touch. She thought of her gift. She thought of what true names did, not just revealed, but called to the surface. Named into being. Whatever she was to him, the curse already knew it. Whatever you are to him, the curse knows. And it is afraid. The bonding ceremony was held 3 days after her arrival, and it was not for her. She understood that clearly by the 2nd hour. The ceremony, ancient, formal, witnessed by representatives from every kingdom that sent tribute to the north, was not a celebration. It was a declaration of legal standing. John Svensson had chosen. The chosen consort passed from their family's legal jurisdiction into his sovereignty. Permanently. Irrevocably. Which meant that whatever Lord Morin had planned for his daughter, he had precisely the duration of this ceremony to act on it before she passed beyond his reach entirely. He arrived with 12 men. Maya saw him from the corridor as she was being prepared, a woman named Signa, quiet and efficient, dressing her in dark fabric that didn't fight with the cold, pinning her hair back with silver that was cold enough to ache against her scalp. Through the doorway she could see the hall filling, could see the kingdom representatives arranging themselves by precedence, and then, moving against the current of ceremony with the particular confidence of a man who believed his money moved faster than protocol. Her father. He had dressed for war. Not armor. Lords didn't wear armor to these things, not since the last king had made it a hanging offense. But the furs he wore were thick enough to hide weapons, and the men around him moved with the careful looseness of people prepared to use their hands. She watched him and felt nothing except a cold, clear certainty that he had not come to observe. The ceremony began. The tribute master recited the pact. John stood on the dais with the absolute stillness she had already come to recognize as his resting state, dressed for formality in dark ceremonial pieces that somehow made him look more, not less, like what he was. Ancient. Immovable. Not performing authority, embodying it. Maya stood at the foot of the dais, and she could feel her father's eyes on her back like a blade being measured. Lord Morin waited until the tribute master reached the declaration of legal transfer, and then he stepped forward. I object. The hall went very quiet. He had prepared his objections carefully. She could tell by the way he spoke them, measured and deliberate, with the cadence of a man who had practiced in mirrors. He challenged the validity of her tribute placement, questioned whether the silencing veil constituted coercion under the pact's terms, introduced a formal claim that Maya Andal carried a condition of inherited madness that made her unsuitable for. John descended from the dais. Not quickly, not with theatrics. He simply stepped down, one step at a time, and walked toward Lord Morin through the parting crowd with the unhurried certainty of a tide coming in. By the time he stopped 3 feet from her father, Morin had stopped speaking, not because he chose to, but because his voice had simply left him. John looked at him. "You will not speak of her condition," John said. His voice was quiet. That was the worst part, Maya thought, how quiet it was. How completely it filled the hall anyway. There is no condition. There is a gift, which her father's house spent 2 decades treating as a disease. That ends here. He turned to the tribute master and spoke the formal acceptance in the ancient tongue, clean and precise, and then turned back to the hall with the expression of a man who had said everything he intended to say and would not be saying more. Lord Morin stood very still. Maya watched him absorb the public dismantling the way she had watched him absorb other setbacks in her life, without visible reaction, while behind his eyes, something shifted into a new configuration. He was not done. She knew it the way she knew true names, certainly, completely. She was right. 3 hours later, when the ceremony had concluded and the hall had half-emptied and Maya had retreated to the corridor outside the great room to breathe air that didn't smell of 12 Kingdoms' political ambition, a hand closed gently on her arm. Lyson. Her half-sister was 4 years younger than Maya and had their father's dark hair and their mother's frightened eyes, and she had always occupied the complicated space between them, not quite friend, not quite enemy, not quite aware enough of her own position to choose. She looked now like a woman who had made a choice that terrified her. "He has a plan," Lyson said. Her voice was barely above breath. "Not just to discredit you. To use you against John." Maya kept her face very still. "Tell me." "I don't know all of it. Only that they know what you are. What you truly are beyond what you told the beast." Lyson's grip tightened. "Maya, when he learns, he won't just leave you. When he learns what you truly are, he won't just leave you. He'll devour you." Maya stood in the cold corridor and let the words settle into her, and then she said, very quietly, "Thank you, Lyson." Her sister released her arm and disappeared back into the hall. Maya stood alone for a moment, breathing carefully, and thought about the frost that retreated from her hands. He required darkness. She had been told this by Signa, who delivered the instruction with the careful neutrality of a woman who had long since decided that the northern beast's requirements were not hers to question. The physical element of the bonding rite would take place without light. He would not allow her to see what the curse looked like when he lost control of it. That was the condition, and it was not negotiable. Maya had agreed without hesitation. Not because she didn't want to see, she wanted to see everything, understand everything, catalog every piece of this situation with the same relentless thoroughness that had kept her alive in her father's house. She agreed because she understood, already, that what he was offering in that condition was not a restriction. It was vulnerability. He was telling her there was something in him he couldn't bear to have witnessed. In the dark of the bonding chamber, she heard him enter before she felt the cold that moved with him. She had been sitting on the edge of the bed in the complete blackness, her eyes useless and her other senses heightened to compensation, and she felt the temperature change first, The cold he carried the way other men carried exhaustion, seeping into the room ahead of him. Then his footsteps, almost silent on the stone floor. Then his breathing. "I won't hurt you," he said. From about 10 feet away. He sounded like a man who had said that sentence before to other women in other ceremonies and had watched it fail to comfort them. "I know," she said. A pause. "You can't know that." "I know your true name," she said quietly. "The one underneath. And it doesn't have cruelty in it." The silence afterward was the longest one yet. She listened to him breathe in the dark and heard something change in the quality of it, something releasing, unwillingly, something he had been holding for a very long time. He moved closer. She could feel him before he touched her, the cold radiating from his skin in waves, the sheer physical presence of him in the dark making the air different, denser. When his hand finally found her arm, she felt two things simultaneously: the bite of the cold through the fabric of her sleeve, and the way his touch was so careful it felt like an apology. "Your hands," she said softly. "They're cold. I can't. I know they're cold." She found his hand in the dark and turned it over, pressing her palm against his. "Hold still." She felt the moment the frost began to retreat from her touch. It was slow, gradual, like watching ice melt in time-lapse without being able to see it, only feel it. The cold against her palm eased. Not completely. Not even mostly. But enough that his hand, which had been rigid with the effort of restraint, slowly relaxed. "That's what you feel," she said. It wasn't a question. "Warmth," he said. His voice had changed. Stripped of something. She didn't have a name for what was stripped out, but the absence of it made him sound, for the first time, like a man rather than a monument. I had forgotten what warmth felt like. In the days that followed, something shifted between them. She wasn't sure when it happened, at what specific moment the research sessions stopped being interrogations and became something else. He asked better questions than she expected. Not just about her power, about how it felt, when it had begun, what her mother had been like, whether the name-speaking hurt or sang or simply arrived like weather. He listened to her answers the way she had never been listened to, completely, without interruption, with the full weight of his attention. She caught herself watching his hands. The way he handled books, delicately, despite the size of his fingers, turning pages with precision. The way the frost runes shifted when he was thinking, complex patterns when he was puzzling through something, simpler when he relaxed. He relaxed less than any person she had ever known. One evening he said, without looking up from the text he was reading, "You don't have to stay in the room while I work. You're not obligated to." "I know," she said. She didn't move. He looked up then. The firelight caught his eyes and turned the pale blue almost gold. Then why? She considered lying. She had always been good at lying. The woman who named everyone else had spent her whole life refusing to be named in return, keeping herself behind walls as tall and cold as his fortress. It was the habit of decades. She chose the truth instead. "Because the longer I stay, the more I want to stay." She held his gaze. "And wanting is dangerous for me." The silence that followed this was not the long calculation kind or the processing kind. It was the kind that happens when two people are in the same place for the first time. "Then stay longer." "I can't. Because the longer I stay, the more I want, and wanting is dangerous for me." The frost patterns on the fortress walls had been spreading for 2 weeks, and Maya had stopped pretending she wasn't tracking them. She had begun marking the patterns in the corridors she walked most often, a small scratch at the edge of each tendril's reach, dated and initialed, and the evidence was inescapable. The curse was accelerating. Where the patterns had moved inches in months before her arrival, they were now moving inches every few days. Some mornings she came to the corridor and found a pattern she had marked the night before had branched 3 times over since she'd slept. John knew. She could tell by the way he moved through the fortress now, with a new quality of urgency under the stillness, the way a man moves when he is working against a clock he doesn't want to acknowledge exists. The nights were the worst. Some nights he came to the research chamber unable to speak. Not unwilling, unable, his jaw set and his eyes white with the cold working through him, the runes on his arms running dark and fast like rivers freezing in real time. On those nights she had learned not to ask questions or offer words. She would cross to him and hold him, practically, with the direct efficiency of someone performing a function, and she would feel the frost slow its work under her hands, feel the tension in his enormous frame ease by degrees. And they would sit like that until he could speak again. It was during one of those nights that he told her the truth. The curse was designed as a balance, he said. His voice was rough from the effort of speaking through the cold. The witch who made it, she didn't want me to die. She wanted me to choose between dying slowly or not living at all. A pause. I could survive indefinitely in isolation. The frost spreads at a manageable pace when there is no warmth for it to feed on. When there is nothing to feel. Maya was very still. And when there is something to feel, the curse feeds on it. The words came out flat and precise, as though he had thought them many times and stripped the emotion from them through repetition. Every moment of warmth I borrow costs 10 moments of cold. It is not metaphor. It is the mechanism. She heard what he wasn't saying. Wanting me, she said carefully, accelerates the curse. Yes, then wanting me is a kill condition. He turned his head to look at her, and she saw it then, 300 years of isolation and the choosing of it, not as cowardice, but as the only form of survival available to him. Love, for me, is how I die. She sat with that for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, the northern wind moved through the fortress like something restless. That is not something you should have told me, she said finally. No. His voice was dry. It was not strategic. Then why? He was quiet for a moment. The runes on his arms pulsed slowly. Because you have been honest with me, he said. From the first moment. And I found I could not continue to be less than that. She thought about Lyson's fractured warning in the corridor. About her father's agents, who she had begun to see in the fortress, faces that didn't belong, men who moved with the careful looseness of purpose. She had not told John about Lyson's warning yet. She had been cataloging, calculating, deciding how much truth was safe. She thought about the frost retreating from her hands. She thought about what Lyson had said, that Morin knew what she truly was. Beyond what she had told John. Beyond name-speaking. The research sessions had been leading somewhere she hadn't been ready to follow. The frost recoiling from her touch. The way true names arrived in her like a tide that could, theoretically, be not just spoken but used. She had known, at the edge of her understanding, that there was a word for what she was that she had been refusing to think. Her father had known it since she was a child. That was why the silencing veil. Not just for the naming. For what the naming could do. The agents in the fortress were not here to retrieve her. They were here to trigger her. Her father has known all along. The attack came on the 14th night. Maya had been expecting it. She had been watching the agents move through the fortress for a week, 3 of them, maybe 4, faces she had catalogued against the backgrounds of her father's house and found familiar. She had not told John because she had been trying to understand the shape of what was planned before she gave him an incomplete picture. That was a mistake she would not make twice. She was in her chambers when the first one came, through the window, which no one should have been able to reach, which meant they had knowledge of the fortress she hadn't known they possessed. He was silent and fast and came at her from behind, and the first thing he said, before she could do anything, before she could form a thought or a name or a breath, was her mother's name. Not Maya's mother's chosen name. Her birth name. Her true name. The sound of it hit Maya like a physical blow. The inheritance, the thing that lived in her blood beneath the name speaking, the deeper layer she had spent her whole life pretending didn't exist, surged up through her with the force of something that had been held down by 3 fingers for 30 years and had finally found the gap. She had always been a name speaker. She had always known that there was something more. She had chosen not to look at it directly. Her mother's true name in a stranger's mouth was not a choice. It was a door kicked open. The power came through her like a winter storm in a closed room. She felt it fill her throat, her hands, the backs of her eyes, not words, but the capacity for words, the raw material from which true names were hewn. She felt it want to release. She felt the agent in front of her try to step back and find he could not. She held. It took everything she had. The same discipline her father's house had taught her through years of punishment and restraint, not submission, but control, the kind that comes from knowing exactly how dangerous you are and choosing, every single day, not to be. She held the surge, turned it, compressed it, and directed it at the single point of the agent in front of her. The room went very cold. Then it went silent. The agent was frozen solid. She was still standing in the center of the room with her hands open at her sides and her breath coming in shallow bursts when the door opened and John filled the frame. He looked at the frozen agent. He looked at Maya. He looked at the floor. From the soles of Maya's feet, frost patterns spread outward across the stone, identical in character to the ones that mapped his forearms. The silence was very long. "You're not a name speaker," John said. "No, you're a name breaker." "Yes." Another silence. The frost patterns at their feet had stopped spreading. The room was very still. "A name breaker can dissolve a cursed name," he said. His voice was flat and precise. "The kind sealed by a witch. The kind sealed 300 years ago. Yes. You could have broken the curse from the first moment." She met his eyes. "I know." She watched him take that in. The frost runes on his arms went through several configurations in quick succession, the complex agitated pattern, then something slower, then something she had never seen before, which was very close to nothing at all. "Why didn't you?" "Because I didn't know," she said. "Not fully. Not the complete shape of what I was. I knew I was more than a name speaker. I didn't know how much more until just now." She paused. "And because," she added, very quietly, "breaking a curse requires consent. Yours. And you never gave it. You're not a name speaker. No, you're a name breaker. Yes. You could have broken the curse from the first moment." "I know." He retreated before she could explain. She had known he would. Not because he was cowardly. There was nothing cowardly in John Srensen. She had understood that within 24 hours of arriving in Thurvold. But because what she had just revealed was not simply personal. It was existential. If she had been able to break the curse from the first moment and had not, regardless of the reason, regardless of the truth of her explanation, the architecture of their arrangement, the logic of his choosing her, the entire careful structure of trust they had been building in small increments over weeks, needed to be rebuilt from the foundation. He needed to be alone with that. She understood it. She hated it. The curse accelerated in his absence. By the second day after he sealed himself in his chambers, the frost patterns in the corridors nearest his rooms had tripled in complexity. By the third day, Signa came to Maya's chambers with her eyes carefully empty and told her that the Lord's hands had gone fully frozen and that he had not come out for food or fire. The window to save him was closing. She could feel it the way she felt true names, not with evidence, not with data, but with the bone-deep certainty of something known. On the fourth day, the door to his chambers opened just enough for a sealed letter to appear on the corridor floor. She did not need to break the seal to know what it said. She could see the shape of it in the gesture, the formal conclusion of arrangements, the careful courtesy of a man who could not stop being precise even in the act of breaking himself apart. She read it anyway. The arrangement was concluded. She was free. She should go. He had written it in a hand that shook in the last two lines, which he had tried to correct and made worse, and seeing the shaking handwriting was the thing that nearly broke her composure. Not his coldness. The effort he had put into hiding it. She set the letter down on the corridor floor. She sat down beside his door with her back against the stone wall, close enough to the wood that she could feel the cold bleeding through it. And she began to speak. Not his name. She was not ready to speak his name yet, and this was not the moment for it. The moment for his name required light and witnesses and his consent, and she would not take that from him. She was not her father's daughter in any way that mattered, and she would not use what she carried as a weapon against a man who was trying to protect her from his own love. She spoke her own name. All of it. The full name. The one that carried her mother's lineage and her mother's mother's lineage before that. The naming inheritance passed down through the women of her blood who had been feared and caged and burned and silenced for every generation she could trace. She spoke the name her father had tried to excise from her. She spoke the name the silencing veil had been designed to keep behind her teeth. She made herself visible completely, without armor, without the walls she had spent her entire life building, in the only way she knew how. She named herself. In the dark corridor outside a sealed door, with the frost spreading past her feet and the cold eating the man she had decided to fight for, Maya Angeldal spoke her full inheritance into the air and let it be heard. The door opens. She chose mourning. Not because of symbolism, though the symbolism was apartment. She chose mourning because light mattered, because the curses breaking required it, because John had lived in darkness and isolation for 3 centuries, and she was not going to allow the end of that to happen in shadow. If this was going to be witnessed, it would be witnessed properly. In full light. With no ambiguity about what had occurred. She had sent Signa to wake the remaining witnesses before dawn, the 3 kingdom representatives who had stayed, the fortress's servants, the guards who had transferred their loyalty to Thurvold's walls over the decades they had served here. She did not know if John would allow this. She had not asked his permission. She had asked him, through the door, in the hour after he opened it, if he was willing to try. He had said yes. 1 syllable. Absolute. The courtyard was cold in the way that only very early northern mornings are cold, the specific, clarifying cold that comes before the day's breath warms the air, when the light is new and everything is still deciding what it will be. Snow from the night before lay undisturbed on the stones. The frost patterns from the fortress walls had reached the courtyard's edges, spreading along the ground like roots. Maya walked toward him. John stood in the center of the courtyard with his hands at his sides and the frost runes blazing across his arms in the densest configuration she had ever seen, the curse at its peak. 300 years of accumulated cold gathered into the last stages of its work. His hands were gray-white. The patterns had reached the center of his chest. He was looking at her with pale eyes that held centuries in them, and something else, something newer, the specific vulnerability of a man who has decided to stop running from the thing pursuing him and simply turn and face it. She stopped in front of him. Around them, in the arched doorways and along the courtyard walls, the witnesses had gathered. She was aware of them the way she was aware of the cold, as context, as the necessary frame for what had to happen here in light, before eyes, with nothing hidden. She took a breath. The true name had been in her since the tribute ground. 300 years sealed in a witch's working, the name that was the lock on the curse. She had felt it from the first moment, known its full shape, known what speaking it completely and in full would do. She had not spoken it in completion because she had been waiting for this, for his consent, for his willingness, for the moment when he chose the warmth instead of the cold. She spoke his true name, not in darkness, not as a secret, not as a weapon or a whisper or a piece of leverage kept for strategic use, as a declaration, as the completion of something that should have been finished 3 centuries ago, before a witch's grief had mistaken possession for love and sealed an innocent man into permanent winter. The name left her lips and hit the air, and the air changed. The frost rune patterns on his arms blazed briefly, blindingly, and then they began to break. Not slowly. All at once, in the way that very old ice breaks when the temperature finally turns, completely, with a sound like every bell in every kingdom ringing simultaneously in a register just below hearing. The patterns on the fortress walls dissolved from the courtyard outward, racing along the stones, erasing themselves as they went. The frost on the ground turned to water. The gray-white of John's hands began, slowly, to recede. He stood in the breaking of his own curse and did not move. She watched his face. Watched the cold empty out of it, not instantly, not all at once, but in degrees, like watching a stone that has been frozen for 3 centuries learn to remember what temperature felt like before winter. His hands came back first, the color returning, the frost retreating from the fingers, the knuckles, the wrists, until the ice rune patterns on his forearms were simply skin. Warm skin. 300 years of winter, and he was standing in morning sunlight. He looked at the sky as though he had forgotten it had that color. Then he looked at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Around them, the witnesses were utterly still, the kind of stillness that comes after witnessing something that recalibrates your understanding of what the world contains. She could hear the sound of water now, running from the walls where the frost had been. She could see the steam rising from the courtyard stones. She could see, for the first time, what John Srensen looked like without the curse written on his body. He looked like a man who had survived something enormous. He looked like someone who had just received news he had stopped believing would ever come. He looked, for the first time, like someone who might have a future. He held her gaze for a long time. And then, slowly, in front of every witness, every kingdom's representative, every person who had ever spoken his name with fear and none of them with love, John Srensen, the Northern Beast. The cursed alpha whom no army had broken and no rival had tamed and no 300 years had bent. Bowed, not to a king, not to a ceremony or a pact or a political arrangement. He bowed to a woman who had sat outside his door in the dark and named herself, who had spoken truth through a silencing veil, who had held his frozen hands in the dark and let the warmth between them be what it was. He bowed to her. The witnesses did not breathe. Maya stood in the morning light and felt the name settle back into her, not gone, not spent, but completed. Whole. The way a sentence feels when the final word is exactly right. She reached out her hand. He straightened. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. And he took it. His skin was warm. She had spoken his name. Now she would learn his story, and he would learn hers. This time, without the cold between them.
If you enjoy watching this story, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.